There's a kind of grief that does not announce itself loudly. It does not ask for sympathy. It does not wear black or speak in whispers at a funeral. It simply lives inside a person, quietly and permanently, like a room in the house of who they are, a room with the door always slightly open, always carrying a faint draft of something unresolved. Raymond Carter had carried that room inside him for 30 years. He was 54 years old, a retired firefighter from Cincinnati, Ohio, and by every visible measure he was a man who had built a good life. He had a wife who loved him, grown children who respected him, a community that trusted him. But the people who knew Raymond best, who had sat with him long enough and watched him go quiet at certain moments, understood that part of him had never left the age of 24. Part of him was still standing on a courthouse step in another city, watching a door close, unable to stop what was happening. His brother's name was Thomas, and for 30 years, Raymond had not known whether Thomas was alive. Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud through thousands of episodes and across every conceivable human emotion. But when the producers came to him in the green room before this particular taping, a Tuesday morning in September 2023, and told him what they had arranged, he sat with it for a long moment before he said anything. Then he nodded once and said, quietly, "Let's do this right." What happened on that stage would stop a studio audience of 200 people mid-breath. It would reduce a retired firefighter to his knees. And it would remind every single person watching in that room and in the millions of living rooms where the episode would eventually air, that the bonds formed in childhood are not always broken by time. Sometimes they are only waiting, intact and patient, for the right moment to be found again. Raymond Carter grew up in Akron, Ohio, in a house that was too small and too loud, and in the way of many such houses, entirely full of love that did not always know how to express itself calmly. His mother, Vera, worked 2 jobs, a diner in the mornings, a hotel laundry in the evenings, and raised her 4 children with a combination of fierce devotion and exhausted practicality. Their father had left before Raymond could form a reliable memory of him, which meant that Raymond, as the eldest, absorbed the responsibility of that absence the way oldest children always do, without being asked, without complaint, and at considerable personal cost. Thomas was the youngest. 7 years Raymond's junior, born in the middle of a February ice storm, he had arrived into the family as something almost unanimously agreed upon as a gift. Where Raymond was serious and watchful, Thomas was quick and laughing and relentlessly curious about everything. He was the child who asked teachers questions they couldn't answer, who befriended the loneliest kid in any room, who stayed up past midnight reading books he had found at yard sales, and then insisted on telling Raymond every detail the next morning while Raymond tried to eat breakfast in peace. Raymond had not always been patient with his younger brother. He was 24 when Thomas was 17, and 24 is a difficult age to be patient from. You are too busy trying to figure out your own life to have much left over for someone else's growing pains. But he loved Thomas in the total, uncomplicated way that oldest siblings love the youngest, with a protectiveness that was sometimes overbearing, always genuine, and rooted in something that had nothing to do with logic. Their mother Vera died when Raymond was 23 and Thomas was 16. It was sudden, a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning at the diner, an ambulance that arrived too late. The house that had been too small and too loud became overnight very large and very quiet. Raymond, already working as a junior firefighter trainee, became de facto guardian to his teenage brother. The two of them navigated that first year of grief together in the imperfect, often wordless way that young men navigate grief, side by side, not quite looking at each other, each one trying to carry enough of it so that the other wouldn't have to carry all of it. The break, when it came, did not arrive as a single dramatic rupture. It arrived as the consequence of a series of smaller failures that compounded over time. Thomas, at 17 and 18 and 19, was struggling in ways that Raymond recognized intellectually, but did not know how to help with practically. He was skipping classes, keeping company that worried Raymond, making decisions that Raymond tried to redirect through the only tools he had available to him, which were authority and ultimatum. Neither worked. When Thomas was 20, a legal matter, the details of which Raymond still speaks about only in general terms, out of respect for his brother's privacy, resulted in Thomas being sentenced to a correctional facility in another state. Raymond visited 3 times in the first year. Visits were difficult in the way that all such visits are difficult, the conversation strained by the setting, by the things neither of them could say, by the guilt on one side and the shame on the other, and the love that sat underneath both of those things without being able to get out. After the third visit, Thomas told Raymond not to come back. He said it quietly, without anger. He said that Raymond seeing him there made it harder for him to hold himself together, and he needed to hold himself together. Raymond drove home on a gray November afternoon and cried the entire 4-hour journey. When Thomas was released, he did not come back to Akron. He sent a brief letter, 1-page, handwritten, saying that he needed to build a life somewhere he wasn't already known, somewhere he could be someone other than Vera Carter's troubled youngest son. He said he loved Raymond. He said he would be in touch. He left no forwarding address. That was 30 years ago. Raymond had never stopped looking. He had searched through every means available to him: social media, public records, mutual acquaintances from the old neighborhood, a private investigator he hired twice over the years. He found traces. A name on an employment record in Georgia 7 years after Thomas left. A man matching his brother's description mentioned in a community newspaper in South Carolina in the late 90s. But every lead went cold before it became confirmation. And eventually Raymond reached a kind of equilibrium that is not acceptance and not surrender, but something in between. The place a person arrives when they have done everything within their power and are learning, slowly and unwillingly, to live with what they cannot control. He still talked about Thomas. To his wife Gail, to his adult children, to colleagues who knew him well enough to ask. He carried a photograph of the two of them, taken at Vera's birthday party, the last one before she died, in the inside pocket of his wallet, where most men keep business cards. Thomas was 16 in that photograph, grinning at something off camera, one arm thrown around his older brother's shoulder with the easy physical confidence of someone who has never had any reason to doubt that the person beside him will always be there. Raymond kept that photograph because it was the last image he had of his brother's face before everything changed, and because some part of him had always believed, without evidence and against the odds, that it would not be the last image he ever had. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Raymond's daughter, Kezia, who was 31 years old, and had inherited her grandmother Vera's instinct for doing something useful when other people were standing around waiting for something useful to happen. She had filled out the application on a Sunday afternoon after watching Raymond go quiet at the dinner table in the particular way she had learned, over a lifetime of dinners, to associate with his thoughts turning toward Thomas. She had not told him she was applying. She had not told him what else she had set in motion. Kezia had found Thomas 4 months before the taping. She had done it methodically and without her father's knowledge, using a combination of genealogy databases, social media research, and eventually a single carefully worded message sent through a platform she had found associated with his name. The message said, "My name is Kezia Carter. I believe my father Raymond is your brother. He has been looking for you for 30 years. He thinks about you every day. If you are willing, I would love to talk." Thomas had taken 3 weeks to respond. When he did, his message was 2 sentences. "I know who you are. I've been trying to work up the courage to reach out for a long time." What followed was 4 months of conversation between Kezia and Thomas, and eventually between Thomas and a family therapist the production team brought in to support the process. Thomas had built a life in Asheville, North Carolina. He was 51 years old. He had spent his 30s in recovery, his 40s rebuilding quietly and steadily, and had arrived at his 50s as a man who was, by his own careful assessment, genuinely all right. He had a small landscaping business. He had close friends. He had a faith practice that anchored him. What he did not have, what he had told the therapist, was the last significant absence in a life he had otherwise made peace with, was his brother. He had not reached out to Raymond because he did not know how to account for 30 years in a way that would be fair to either of them. He did not know how to ask for forgiveness without making the other person responsible for granting it. He had written letters he never sent. He had found Raymond's address through public records and driven to Cincinnati once, parked outside the house, and then driven back to Asheville without getting out of the car. When Kezia explained what she had planned, the Family Feud taping, the controlled setting, the presence of a therapist on standby, the fact that Raymond would not be blindsided in a private space, but in a public one surrounded by people who were rooting for both of them, Thomas had sat quietly for a long time. Then he said, "He'll have somewhere to put his hands. He'll have something to do with his body. That'll help him." Kezia asked what he meant. Thomas said, "Raymond always needed something to hold on to when things got big. That's why he became a firefighter. Give him a context and he can handle anything." Kezia had told no one else in the family. The secret was between her and Thomas and the production team and eventually Steve Harvey himself. On the day of the taping, Raymond arrived at the studio in Los Angeles in good spirits. wearing a suit his wife had pressed the night before and carrying the easy confidence of a man who is comfortable in high-stakes situations. The Carter family, Raymond, his wife Gail, Kezia, his son Marcus, and his sister-in-law Deanne, made their way through the pre-show preparation with good humor and low-level excitement. Raymond kept telling everyone he had no idea what answers to give because he had never watched much television, and Kezia kept telling him that was the least of his concerns, and he laughed at that without knowing why she said it with that particular expression on her face. The main game was close and lively. Raymond was exactly what Thomas had predicted, a man who operated with calm precision when given a structure to operate within. He had an instinct for the obvious answer, the one that a survey of 100 ordinary people would land on most reliably, which is perhaps not surprising for someone who had spent decades reading rooms and making fast decisions under pressure. The Carter family took the game by a margin that delighted the audience and left the opposing family gracious and smiling. Then it was time for fast money. Marcus went first, Raymond's son, 28 years old, nervous in the way that young men are nervous when they want to prove something to their fathers. He scored 139 points, which he delivered back behind the partition with a look that said he knew it might not be enough and hoped it was. Raymond patted his shoulder once, firmly, the way Raymond communicated most things that mattered to him, and walked to the podium. The studio lights were very bright. The audience had the particular energy of a crowd that knows something the person at the center of the room does not. Steve Harvey approached Raymond with his usual stride, unhurried, warm, completely in command of the space. But when he reached Raymond and looked at him directly, something in his expression shifted. He stayed there for just a moment longer than the format required. The two men, roughly the same age, looked at each other with the instinctive recognition of men who have carried heavy things and learned not to show it unnecessarily. "Raymond," Steve said, "tell me something. In all your years as a firefighter, all those times you walked into something dangerous, what kept you steady?" It was not a standard pre-fast money question. The audience noticed. Raymond noticed. But he answered without hesitation in the direct, unornamented way of a man who does not dress up his truths. "Knowing someone was counting on me to come back out." Steve nodded slowly. "That's the right answer," he said then. 20 seconds on the clock. Here we go. Name something a brother gives you that no one else can." Raymond said without a pause. "Back up. Name something people carry with them for decades." A beat then. "Guilt." "Name a reason a man might cry when he thinks no one is watching." Raymond's jaw moved slightly before he spoke. "Missing someone." Name something that gets harder the longer you wait to do it. "Saying sorry." Name what home really means. Raymond looked straight ahead and said, quietly and with great certainty, "Your people." The buzzer sounded. The audience had gone very still. Steve Harvey was not looking at the scoreboard. "Let's see how you did," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who is choosing every word with exceptional care. The board turned. Backup number one answer, 38 points. The audience applauded but did not erupt, held in check by something it couldn't name. Guilt number one answer, 33 points. A murmur rising. Missing someone number one answer, 41 points. 3 rows of women in the audience were holding each other. Saying sorry number one answer, 29 points. The room was barely breathing. Your people, the board turned for the final time. Number one answer, 44 points. Total, 324 points. The studio should have exploded. A perfect fast money round, a score the show had almost never seen. But instead, the audience went completely, utterly silent because Steve Harvey had not moved, had not smiled, had not raised his arms in celebration. He was standing very still, looking at Raymond, and the expression on his face was not the face of a game show host delivering good news. It was the face of a man about to witness something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He stepped forward. He placed one hand briefly on Raymond's arm. And then he leaned in, close enough that what he said was meant only for Raymond, though the microphone caught it and every person in that studio and every person who would later watch that clip would hear it clearly. He whispered, "Look up." Raymond looked up. At the back of the stage, in the place where the set ended and the ordinary world began, a door had opened. A man stood in the doorway. He was 51 years old, shorter than Raymond remembered, but with the same square jaw, the same slight forward tilt of the head that Raymond had spent 30 years recognizing in strangers on the street and being briefly, painfully disappointed by. He was wearing a plain gray jacket. His hands were at his sides. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was now standing inside the consequence of it, waiting to find out if he had been right. His name was Thomas Carter. Raymond did not move immediately. This is the detail that every person who has watched the clip remembers most. Not the reunion itself, but the 3 seconds before it, when Raymond simply stood at the podium and looked at his brother across 30 years and a studio floor, and processed something that the human nervous system is not really designed to process quickly. His wife Gail, watching from behind the partition, later described it as the moment she understood what her husband had been carrying all those years. "I always knew he missed Thomas," she said, "but in those 3 seconds I saw the actual weight of it, and then I saw it leave him." Raymond crossed the stage. The two men met in the middle, and the embrace that followed was not the polished, telegenic hug of a television reunion. It was the embrace of two people who have been separated long enough that the act of physical contact with someone you love requires a moment of recalibration. The body has to relearn what it already knows. Raymond's arms went around Thomas and locked, and Thomas pressed his forehead against his brother's shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a very long time. The audience, released from its silence by the reality of what it was witnessing, responded with the kind of sustained, uncoordinated applause that happens when people are clapping not for a performance, but simply because they need to do something with the feeling in their chests. Steve Harvey stood to one side with his hands clasped in front of him and his eyes very bright. He did not speak. He had understood, from the moment the producers had brought him into this plan, that his job in this particular moment was not to host, but to protect the space, to keep the machinery of the show quiet enough that two brothers could have the moment they had been owed for 3 decades. When Raymond and Thomas finally separated enough to look at each other, Raymond put both hands on either side of his brother's face in the gesture of a man who needs to confirm with his hands what his eyes are telling him. Thomas was laughing and crying simultaneously, in the specific way that happens when a feeling is too large to come out as only one thing. "You got old," Raymond said, and his voice broke completely on the last word, and the audience laughed through their tears because it was so precisely the thing that one brother would say to another after 30 years that it required no explanation. "You too," Thomas said. Kezia came through from behind the partition and walked directly to her uncle, the uncle she had spoken with for 4 months through a screen, and was meeting in person for the first time. Thomas held her for a long time and said something into her ear that she later told the follow-up cameras was the thing she would carry with her longest from that day. He said, "You did what I didn't have the courage to do. Thank you for being braver than me." When the family had gathered on stage and the first wave of the reunion had settled into something that could accommodate words, Steve Harvey sat down with the two brothers side by side. He did not begin with the game or the score. He began with a single, direct question. "Thomas," he said, "what do you want your brother to know?" Thomas took a breath. He had clearly thought about this, had perhaps been thinking about it for years, but the presence of the actual person made even prepared words difficult to access. He spoke slowly. "I want him to know that leaving wasn't about him. I know it probably felt like it was. I know what it looks like from the outside. A man walks away and doesn't look back. But I was drowning, and I was ashamed of drowning, and I didn't know how to let him pull me out without pulling him under too." He paused. "Thought leaving was the most unselfish thing I could do. I was wrong, but I was 20 years old and I didn't know that yet." Raymond was looking at the floor. When he raised his head, his expression was the particular expression of a man who has just heard something he needed to hear and is understanding for the first time that the story he told himself about what happened was missing an essential piece. "I thought you were angry at me," Raymond said. "I thought I failed you and you couldn't look at me." "No," Thomas said immediately. "No, never." Steve Harvey let that land. Then he said simply, 30 years of the wrong story, and now you have the right one." He turned to the camera and addressed the audience in the studio and at home directly. "What you just watched is not a television moment. It is a human moment that happened to occur on television. These two men have been living with a misunderstanding for 3 decades that could have been corrected in 5 minutes if either of them had known what the other was actually carrying." He paused. "That is the story of more families than any of us want to admit. And what Kezia did, quietly, persistently, without her father's knowledge, because she believed it was worth the risk, that is an act of love that I want every young person watching to understand. Sometimes healing a family requires someone to go first. She went first." The episode aired 6 weeks after the taping. The clip of Steve Harvey's whispered, "Look up," 3 seconds of audio, the turn of Raymond's head, and then Thomas in the doorway became one of the most shared pieces of television footage of that year. It was not shared primarily by entertainment accounts. It was shared by people who attached personal notes, by sons who tagged their estranged fathers, by siblings who had not spoken in years, by parents who had grown up in foster care and were still looking for brothers and sisters the system had separated them from. The clip became, in the unsentimental language of the internet, a permission slip. a piece of evidence that reaching out after a very long time was something that people survived and were glad they did. Raymond and Thomas did not immediately step back into the relationship as though the 30 years were a parenthesis. They were too honest and too experienced for that. What they did instead was begin, deliberately, at a pace both of them could sustain, the work of becoming brothers again in the present tense rather than only in memory. They called each other on Sunday evenings. They were both, it turned out, early risers who drank their coffee before the rest of the household was awake, and they began spending those early mornings in loose, unhurried conversation about the ordinary details of their lives. Raymond's garden, Thomas's landscaping clients, the weather in Cincinnati versus the weather in Asheville, the relative merits of various baseball teams on which they disagreed with comfortable passion. Raymond flew to Asheville 4 months after the taping. It was the first time he had seen where his brother lived. Thomas showed him the landscaping business, a modest operation with 3 employees and a client list built entirely on word of mouth and reputation. Raymond walked around the nursery where Thomas kept his inventory of plants and trees and said almost nothing, but Thomas understood from the expression on his face that he was performing the same silent calculation that Raymond had always performed when he encountered something his brother had built, measuring it against what he had feared, and finding the gap between fear and reality to be wide and relieving. They visited their mother's grave together the following spring. It was the first time either of them had been there with the other. Raymond had maintained the grave for 30 years, fresh flowers on Vera's birthday, a visit on the anniversary of her death. Thomas had not been back to Akron since he left. Standing at the grave together, they were both quiet for a long time. Then Thomas said, "She would have gotten us back in the same room eventually. She always found a way to get people in the same room." Raymond smiled. "She would have made it a lot louder than Family Feud." They both laughed, and the laughter had in it something that the grief had been waiting a long time to make space for. The Kezia question, what to do about the daughter who had engineered the reunion without her father's knowledge, resolved itself in the way that most family negotiations resolve themselves when the underlying love is not in question. With some initial discomfort, one honest conversation, and then a new and better understanding. Raymond had been briefly, genuinely unsettled to learn how much Kezia had done without telling him. He felt, he told her, like the last person to know something that was entirely about him. Kezia told him that she had kept it from him because she was not certain it would work, and she had not wanted to raise his hopes and then be responsible for the collapse of those hopes if Thomas had declined. Raymond thought about that for a while. Then he told her she was the most capable person in the family, which, coming from Raymond Carter, was the highest compliment available. 6 months after the taping, Family Feud aired a follow-up segment. Raymond and Thomas appeared together on stage for the first time since the original episode, this time both in front of the cameras, both introduced by Steve Harvey with the particular warmth he reserved for people whose stories had stayed with him. The studio audience recognized them immediately, and the reception was, by any measure, overwhelming. Thomas spoke first. He talked about Asheville, about his business, about the recovery he had maintained for over 20 years with the consistency of someone who understands that some achievements require daily renewal. He did not speak about the past in detail. That was his to carry, and he carried it with a dignity that the audience recognized and respected. He spoke instead about the present, about Sunday phone calls, about Raymond's visit to Asheville, about a trip they were planning together to see a baseball game in Cincinnati that summer. He spoke about it all in the measured, deliberate way of a man who has learned not to take ordinary things for granted, because he knows what it costs to lose them. Raymond spoke last. He had written notes, which was unlike him, because Raymond Carter was a man who preferred to think on his feet. But he had decided this required the notes. He said, "I want to say something to anyone watching this who has a Thomas in their life, a person they've lost track of. A brother, a sister, a friend, someone they think about and don't reach out to because too much time has passed, or because they don't know what to say, or because they're afraid of what the answer might be." He looked up from the notes. "Don't wait 30 years. I can tell you from personal experience that 30 years is too long. 10 years is too long. Start with one message. You don't have to explain everything. You just have to open the door, let them decide whether to walk through it. But open the door." He folded the notes and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to the photograph of the two of them at their mother's birthday party. The photograph he would, the following Christmas, have duplicated and framed and given to Thomas, who hung it in the front room of his house in Asheville, where it was the first thing anyone saw when they came in. Steve Harvey, sitting across from the brothers during the follow-up, found himself doing the same thing he had done on the day of the original taping, watching and staying quiet, which was not his natural setting, and which the people who worked with him daily found quietly remarkable. When he did speak, it was brief. "I've said a lot of words on this stage over the years," he said. "Some of them were pretty good, but the best 3 words I ever said were 2 syllables and a pause." He smiled. "Look up." The audience applauded, but the moment that stayed with people who watched the follow-up, the moment that circulated separately on social media with a frequency that surprised even the producers, was what Thomas said in response. Looked at Steve Harvey and said, "I want you to know something. When I was standing at that door and I saw my brother at that podium and I heard his answers on the monitor backstage, I almost turned around. 30 years of absence is a long time to answer for. I almost decided I wasn't worth the reunion." He paused. "And then you whispered to him, and I watched him look up. And the way he looked at me was exactly the same as the last time I saw him. Not angry. Not disappointed. Just there. Just completely there. And I thought, I'm not going to walk away from that again." The story of Raymond and Thomas Carter is, in its bones, a story about the false arithmetic of estrangement, the way that time apart accumulates in the mind as evidence of permanent damage when it is often, in reality, only evidence of 2 people who did not know how to find each other. It is a story about the misunderstandings that harden into decades when no one corrects them, and about what becomes possible when someone decides that the risk of reaching out is smaller than the cost of continued silence. It is also, in a quiet way, a story about Kezia Carter, who submitted a Family Feud application on a Sunday afternoon because she loved her father and could not stand the thought of him carrying that room inside him for the rest of his life. Who found her uncle through databases and patience and a single carefully worded message. Who kept a 4-month secret because she understood, with the clarity of someone who had not been inside the original wound and could therefore see its shape from the outside, that sometimes healing a family requires someone to act without permission. Raymond kept the notes he read from at the follow-up taping. He gave a copy of them to Kezia, who keeps it folded in her wallet in the same place her father keeps his photograph. She has never shown it to anyone. She does not need to. She already knows what it says.